Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. Lindsay Malloy.
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Parenting Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy flip?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. My co-host, Dr. Lindsay Malloy, is away on a much-deserved research sabbatical, so I'm going to do my best to hold things down for the both of us on this season of the podcast. Back in 2020, Lindsay and I founded Pandemic Parenting in order to share science-based research and to help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together. Researchers around the world, including Lindsay and myself, have been hard at work researching the impact of COVID-19 on children and families. We've tracked more than 200 of these studies being published, and this season, we're going to discuss many of the direct implications for us parents. So let's dive in. Please note that the information contained in this podcast and on the Pandemic Parenting website are intended for educational purposes only. Nothing discussed in this podcast or provided on the website are intended to be a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. No doctor-patient relationship is formed between the hosts or guests of this podcast and listeners. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health or medical provider, we encourage you to seek one in your area. When Dr. Malloy and I started hosting webinars and later recording this podcast in the past 2 years, we dove into specific questions that parents were asking as we started to navigate the challenges of the pandemic. With the help of over 50 different guest experts, we translated information about the science of child development, trauma, mental health, family relationships, and more. We used what the science community already knew about these topics to try and support parents in real time as the pandemic surged on. But now, in 2022, we have even more relevant research available. Researchers that launched studies right as COVID-19 was becoming a reality are gradually publishing their findings. These findings build on the knowledge we already had, like many of the conversations we facilitated last season, and they'll continue to inform us as parents and caregivers as we also continue to navigate the pandemic and its aftermath. So that's what we're going to do this season. We're going to dive into the newly published research about the impacts of COVID-19 on children and families. Along the way, we'll talk with researchers who conducted these studies and identify practical insights and key takeaways we can incorporate into our lives right now. So before we dive into the research in future episodes, we wanted to set the stage a bit. How do we as parents understand the science behind all these articles, videos, and social media posts where we're finding this information? What does it mean to develop the skills to read and think critically about this information? To develop what is referred to as science literacy.
Science is slow, especially science about human beings and especially about kids.
That's Dr. Eric Youngstrom, one of our 2 guest experts I sat down with to talk about science literacy and delve into some specific concepts and terms we'll be returning to time and time again throughout this season of the podcast.
Yeah, Amanda, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I also am the co-founder of a nonprofit helping give away psychological science. I also am a parent and a licensed clinical psychologist, and so have all of those roles, and also have a family history of mental illness, and have had a lot of conversations with my daughters as they've been growing up. And so there are many, many different hats that I've been trying to figure out how to wear over the last 2 decades.
I also spoke with a science journalist, Melinda Wenner Moyer. Melinda is also the author of the book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, Science-Based Strategies for Better Parenting from Tots to Teens.
I'm a science journalist and a mom of 2 kids. I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. I have been writing about science and medicine and science in parenting now for like 15 years. I guess the parenting part more like 10 years. And I write for different publications. I freelance, but mostly for Scientific American and the New York Times. And I also teach now at NYU in their journalism program.
You might have heard a scientist or reporter say something like, well, there's very good research to suggest XYZ, but what does good research look like? And why does it take so long? The pandemic started almost 2 years ago, and we're only now seeing some of the first publications about the impact on children and families being published. Why is that?
It's a very scripted thing. And one of the things, if you're not inside that area, one of the things which is surprising is how formulaic it is in a lot of ways. The best analogy that I could describe is like writing limericks. There are these rules, and a good limerick has to have this many words, and then this many words, and then this many. So for the first 80% of my career, the premium, if you wanted to get nerd famous, then you would do a lot of these nerd haikus that sort of gradually extended and moved the ball. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've had a nerd crisis of science is supposed to be reproducible. And here, the analogy that I use is to cooking. A good research article should describe the methods. Here's the steps that we took to do the science. And the idea is that if anybody else picked up the same recipe and got the same ingredients, they should get the same result. And if you follow the same steps with the same ingredients and you don't get the same result, that's a problem for the idea. A big thing that's happened in the last 5-6 years is that people have looked at all of our classic nerd haikus, 100 of the most cited influential articles, and tried to follow the same recipe. And what you're shaking your head, do you already know what percentage of our recipes actually duplicated?
I don't.
Less than half.
Oh.
Around a third. So then there was a big food fight in the kitchen, and
love these analogies.
And all the people that came up with the famous recipe, it was really awkward that their famous recipe didn't reproduce, and all the people that did it are like, yeah, that is pretty awkward. And so then the food fight mode, they're like, but you're a hack. You're someone that no one's ever heard of, and we're famous, important people. And but it turns out that that's not supposed to be relevant to science. It doesn't matter whether you're famous or not. The good science, anybody that follows the same recipe is supposed to get the same thing.
Yeah.
So reproducibility is key.
Yeah, which if people have heard that term, the replication crisis in some of these disciplines, that's what you're describing. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, so at this point, Eric and I talked for more than a half hour about the process of designing and conducting scientific research. But you are a busy parent and may not want to hear all of our nerdy academic tangents, so I'll give you a quick summary. To stick with Eric's recipe analogy, here's how it typically works. First, you have to come up with a hypothesis. This is like an educated guess about what's going to happen. It's like writing a recipe. So if I use these ingredients and these appliances, this is what I anticipate will happen based on my past experience with cooking and what I know about combining these ingredients in this way. More and more often, researchers are also now pre-registering their hypothesis. So this is like giving the recipe to somebody else before you go into the kitchen. That way, I can't say that I'm going to bake a casserole, and then when it doesn't come out the way I wanted, mash it up and claim that I was trying to make beef stew all along. Then, when your research study involves animals or human participants, you also have to get special approval. Typically, an institutional review board or an IRB reviews your recipe to make sure that the benefits of the study will outweigh the risks and that you are taking proper precautions to prevent harm and deal with any unexpected adverse events. When you do research that involves children or other vulnerable populations, they review your study in even more depth to make sure that the procedures are safe and that you're minimizing any potential harm. Next, depending on the type of study, you have to make sure you have a large enough sample size. Melinda will talk more about this in a bit, but for now, just know that you need enough people in your study to be able to draw conclusions that are credible. Then, you run the experiment or launch the survey or whatever your particular cooking method might be. Once you are done collecting data, once you complete your experiment, it's time to analyze the data. So in our analogy, this would be like taking a bite. Did it come out the way I anticipated? If so, why is that the case? If not, then you spend time analyzing and interpreting the results to try and understand and explain why things didn't come out the way you expected. And finally, you write up your results. And then, after all that, which is typically months or even years from the time you first came up with your hypothesis to writing up your results, it's finally time to publish or share your recipe with others. But even that can take a while.
You write it up, you pick a place that you want to send it, and you send it off to them, and they send it out for peer review.
So are we talking, just to clarify, like I could send it to People magazine, or I could send it to the Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology? How do I pick?
You could, and you also could publish it on your own on your own website.
Okay.
But for it to be taken seriously as potential science, you need to send it to somewhere that's going to add this extra quality control layer of peer review. So we could take my dissertation as an example. So dissertation is the project that you do and then write up and present to a committee for them to decide, did you do good enough work that we would give you your PhD? So take that, cut it into about a third of the size, follow all of our rules about formatting, and then send it in. And we will then take your name off it and send it to other people. That's 2 to 5 other experts for them to decide, is it good enough or not?
Which they take your name off it because of what you were talking about before, which is we don't want there to be bias. If this is a really famous big name scientist, we don't want to just say, yes, this is a good study because so-and-so did it.
Right. No, it's fascinating. It really levels the playing field. So if you were some famous big dog, they'd take your name off and nobody's like, oh, wow, this is by famous big dog.
Right.
And when you're a nobody starting out, like I was with my dissertation, you're not penalized for being a nobody just starting out.
Yeah.
So that's cool. That's still, I just got chills sort of describing the level playing field that ideally science is supposed to be. You take the ingredients that we usually are working with, you are allowed to try your hand at this. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So everything goes right. You get in on the revise and resubmit. It's now 6 months since you knew the answer, but the rest of the world doesn't know if they can trust it.
Yeah.
Now, as soon as it's accepted, they turn it into a PDF and they put it up online, which sounds really good. But the problem for parents and the problem for clinicians is that, especially in psychology, 80-90% of what we're doing is behind a paywall.
Yeah.
So really expensive and really frustrating for parents and clinicians is the part that's so dumb.
Yeah.
When so much published research is behind a paywall, it can be hard for those who aren't a researcher or a student to access that information. And like we mentioned, all of these findings are written to an audience of other scientists. So there's a lot of jargon that the average parent won't have time to figure out even if they did get past the paywall. This is where science journalists like Melinda Moyer can help. I asked Melinda to walk us through some key terms to understand when reading about research, whether you're reading the original publication or maybe a news article that's summarizing the findings.
You can say evidence-based anything and it just sounds more credible, right? And there's really no, there's nothing limiting anybody from using that term. It's not like you have to apply for a license to be able to say something's evidence-based or science-based or research-based. So they get used a lot. I think of it as, okay, this particular claim or method or whatever it is that's using the evidence-based, science-based, it has published peer-reviewed research backing it up, like backing up the claims, backing up the recommendations. It is rooted ultimately in science and in the scientific process. So that's how I think about it. But again, if you just see that term, it doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Right.
People can use it just to make something sound better and more credible. So you have to be a little careful when you come across that.
Yeah. And do that further digging you described, like just because something says it's evidence-based or science-based, go further, find out what was the science they based it on, or what is the evidence backing up these claims? Yeah,
absolutely. Yep.
So now what about, samples, right? Or is a term that's often used in these studies. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you tell the difference between what is a quality study, meaning how many people were in the sample or group of people they evaluated or asked that research question about. And things like, what does randomized mean? What does representative mean? So talk about sort of samples and studies.
Yeah. So this is something I didn't mention when I talked about how I look at a study, but certainly the size is important. If this is a study of people, which hopefully it is, although there's very great, important research that's done in animals. I don't mean to denigrate it, but the more people generally, the better. If you have a study with just 10 people in it, then you can probably trust the findings less than you could if it was 1,000 people, just because, 10 people, there's more room for there to be bias, or, it's just fewer people that you're studying. And so you can trust that a little bit less. But in addition to the size of a particular study, especially when you're looking at like survey-based studies where researchers are asking people questions, you really want to check that the sample is, so a representative sample is one term. And that means that the sample is from a subset of the population that accurately reflects a larger population. So let's say you're looking at a study on how mothers in the US are coping with the pandemic. You want to be sure that that particular study wasn't just asking, wealthy moms or moms in Washington, DC, or moms whose kids go to a particular school. You really want to make sure that if you want to extrapolate from this is how moms everywhere feel, you better be pretty sure that the sample that they surveyed reflects this greater population of moms in the US, and not just some sort of biased small sample that's different from the larger population. And randomized is similar in the sense that, it's like a random sampling of people rather than a sampling from a particular subset or, subgroup of the population. So those are terms that you hopefully see if you're reading a study or a press release about a survey that's being done. You want that sample to be reflecting the bigger sample that you're extrapolating about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Or if it's not, to, as you kind of said, to be skeptical about that, but also look for whoever's writing about that study or that sample to be forthcoming about, yes, here are the limitations, or this study ended up being only people from a certain region in the US or moms of a certain race or ethnicity. And so there are limitations to what we can interpret from these results. It doesn't mean there might not be helpful findings that emerge, but yes, you want to make sure that scientist or whoever's writing about that study is being, open and transparent about what those limitations are. What is your process when you're reading research, and you're saying like, how do I know if something's trustworthy, or where does this information come from? Yeah. What are some of those questions you ask yourself when you read things?
Yeah. So the first big one is, where is the information coming from? Is this a press release that I'm reading? And so, a press release is like something that's written by people in a company or people at an academic institution. And really the goal is to, make the research sound really important and interesting, either to, sell something if it's in the case of a company, or to, just benefit the reputation of the scientists if it's scientists at a university or at a hospital or a medical center. So, press releases are great, and I read them all the time, and I get bazillions of them in my inbox because a lot of people have figured out, I cover science, so let's send Melinda press releases. They're great, but you have to read them with a big grain of salt, because the people who are writing press releases, they have really strong incentives to hype the claims that they're making in their press releases, to make the science seem more exciting, more interesting, more important than it really is sometimes, because again, they're trying to really sell something a lot of the time. So, when I read a press release, there's also like different qualities of press releases. Some of them are actually really, really well done, especially at academic institutions. They will include information like, what are the limitations of this research? What are the weaknesses? What are the things that we don't know? And when I read a press release and I see information like that, that's when I know, okay, I can trust this press release a little more than I can trust one that's like, new cure for cancer will change the world, So I'm looking at the language. I'm looking at, is this couched in nuance? Is it not? Is it really hyperbolic? Is it not? What kinds of things are included? And that helps me understand whether it's trustworthy. That's if it's a press release, right? Some science information I'm getting is directly from studies that are published. And so in that case, I'm looking at, again, I'm reading the language, like what is, how are these scientists writing about their findings? Are they being careful? Are they, again, kind of, seeming to be a little too excited about them? Where was the study published? Was it published in a journal that is well respected, that has the peer review process built into it, in which, in order for a study to get published, it has to be read by a panel of scientists in the same field who were not involved in the research, who really, read it carefully, who understand what kinds of design aspects should be, included in this kind of study, who really, vet the study and make sure that it's good enough to be published in a journal. So, is it published in a peer reviewed journal? Is it not? Is it not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal? And during the pandemic, there have been a lot more preprints, as they're called, which are studies, and because we want the information as quickly as we can get it with COVID, a lot of studies are being published on servers before they have gone through that peer review process. And so if I'm looking at a study like that, I'm a little more cautious because I know, it hasn't really been vetted by other scientists. I'm looking also at the numbers, the statistics in it. I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but there's information you can look at in a study that reflects essentially like the likelihood that the results were not just due to random chance, that you can actually trust that, if there was an intervention being tested, that the benefits of this were real to some, and were the result of the intervention. So you can look at study design. You can look at, what kind of study it is. Is it a clinical trial? Is it just a sort of observational study where, let's say, researchers are finding associations between things like, okay, a study finds that people who say they eat a lot of spinach are less likely to get into car accidents. And the conclusion they make is like eating spinach prevents car accidents. And you have to think, well, wait a minute, this is just a correlation, an association between two things. And we have to be really careful about how we interpret that. We can't really say eating spinach prevents car accidents if we're looking at just an association, but there could be some other reason. Maybe just people who are very health conscious tend to eat spinach and also drive more carefully. And it's not that the spinach has anything to do with the car accident. So you have to sort of think about like, how was it designed? What are the conclusions we can make based on how it's designed? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff here. Oh, and another really big one, is this a study that actually involved people, or was it done in animals or just cells? So there's, I remember learning in graduate school, one of my professors used to say, we've cured cancer in mice millions of times. So if you're looking at a study and it says, we've now cured, breast cancer with this new drug in mice, okay, that doesn't mean that it's going to work in people. So you really have to look at details like that too. But honestly, one of the best ways, because it can be really hard when you're reading a study that's in a field that I'm not a scientist. And I'm reading studies in so many different fields that do things so differently. And there's so many different considerations. So what I find is, I might be able to get some indication looking at a study or a press release of how well the study was done, but I also might not. And what I always do though, if I'm going to cover a study or if I'm thinking about it, is I will reach out to other scientists in the field who were not involved in the study and, well-respected scientists and say, can you take a look at this study? Does this look like a good study? Does this look like information that we can trust? Because they are often the best people to ask because they're in this field. They know how things work. They know what the important, statistical controls need to be that I'm not necessarily going to know. And so that's something that I almost always do when I'm looking at covering a study, talk to outside researchers. They can really, really be helpful.
Oh, so many great examples in there. Your example of being reminded, when studies are in mice versus human, like that, it was reminding me that when I was pregnant with my first son, I read a study that talked about the brain shrinks. You lose 7% of your cognitive capacity with each pregnancy. And I was like losing my mind, like, oh my gosh, wow, that is, and then realized it was a study on rats. So, we're not quite ready to extrapolate that to humans, but that was reassuring to me once I was teasing through also, right? Oh, okay. Let's remember what this study was for.
Yes, so important. But, some outlets that will cover science, like will cover press releases or cover studies, they will not make that clear. Like they will miss that and they will, they will cover it in such a like breathtaking way. And that's really tricky. I mean, and I've that's really hard for the average person to be able to tell, like, is this piece of journalism covering this study well or not?
Right.
And I mean, there's so many layers in which things can, and ways in which things can sort of get misconstrued or overhyped. And it's very, very hard for the average person to be able to tell, like, can I trust this?
Right. I'm thinking about, as you're describing your process, the time it takes and the nuance that you described, and, peeling away all these layers to truly understand what a study looked at. And I mean, just thinking about, your normal everyday parent's capacity for that. And just, I have 5 seconds, I'm scrolling social media, I see a headline or I see a statistic, and how do I, the typical consumer of news and media, tell the difference between this statistic and this headline that's very sensationalized versus an actual, legitimate kind of credible reporting of findings. So I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts or suggestions for that, because, most of us are not able to do the thorough process you described.
Yes, no, I know. We don't have time to do anything other than the things that we're doing to survive right now, let alone, spend 20 minutes looking at a study. Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, what I would say is it can be helpful to find sources that you trust. So, I know, for instance, that there are some really great science reporters at the New York Times, and there are great science reporters at, different journalistic outlets where, and I've gotten to the point where I could say, I know that if Apoorva Mandavilli is saying this, I can pretty much trust that she's a reporter with the New York Times, for instance, because she is a trained science journalist and she knows how to do this, and she's paid to do this, and she does this with every study. So I suggest finding journalistic sources, and of course, also turning to sources of information that you can trust, like the American Academy of Pediatrics or the, CDC, where, that what they're putting out is being vetted by scientists or doctors, and it's trustworthy. But it's hard. Like, you have to settle on, well, what are those sources going to be? I mean, and I would say, like, some of my favorites are some of the places that I love to write for, because they do like to hire science journalists. So this is, Scientific American, Popular Science does a great job. The New York Times, the Washington Post, a lot of the big newspapers have very good science journalists on staff. And so if you can get your information from these sort of mainstream places where they're really doing their homework and they're trying to ensure that they're putting out, vetted scientific information, then you're going to be better off than just clicking the first thing that comes up on Google or clicking a headline from a place you've never heard of, where this could be a place that's sort of like a science information mill where people are just like regurgitating press releases and publishing them as if they're articles that you can trust. So, and I'll talk too for a minute, a little bit later, I think, about like, how do you figure out whether to trust a website or an organization or a journalistic source. But
I was just thinking about that. Feel free to talk about it now, because I was thinking about, like, what is that healthy skepticism we should have, when we're reading things.
Yeah. So again, this is, you come up against the issue of time again. So I actually just wrote a piece for Scientific American about how do we teach, like, news literacy to kids, which I know you mentioned that you saw. And there's a lot of disagreement in the field about how do we do this well. And we need more research, but there's one approach that was discussed that was really, really beneficial in a study. And I'll describe the study. And I mean, it takes a little time, but it really works. So researchers at Stanford, this was a study done, I think, in 2019. They asked a handful of history professors and a handful of journalism fact checkers and a handful of just undergraduate students at Stanford to try to figure out how trustworthy a particular website was. And they watched what these different groups of people did and how they tried to figure out whether this website was trustworthy. And they found that the history professors and the undergraduates tended to, when they were given the website, they tended to scroll around and click around on that one website to see, like, the About Me section, or, the About Us or whatever, and reading about the organization on the website itself, and looking at, is this a .com or a .org or a .edu? And these can be useful things to look at. But ultimately, when they did this, some of these websites that are maybe biased, they are very good and very slick. And they sometimes look like, oh, we are totally trustworthy. You can completely trust us. The way they write stuff is, they're very manipulative. And so these historians and the undergraduate students could not generally figure out if a website was actually, credible and trustworthy. They often said, yes, this is great, this is trustworthy, when actually it was a website that was tied to an industry funded group, or, a website that's really kind of been known to have issues with bias. The journalism fact checkers, on the other hand, they did not spend time on the website itself, looking through the different pages and reading about the website. They immediately opened a bunch of new tabs and they Googled the organization. And they started reading, they looked down at the results and said, oh, that's interesting. There's a New York Times article that talks about this organization. Even just Wikipedia sometimes has really useful information saying like this particular organization is a, conservative think tank or a very liberal think tank or this or that or the other. And essentially they spent no time on that website itself, but they immediately went to look for other trustworthy sources of information that could give them an indication of this organization's merit and credibility. So this is something I think, we can learn from this, that if we are on a website and it's saying, oh my gosh, there's this new crazy thing happening in the world or new thing to worry about or whatever it is, and it seems like maybe you want to do a little more research, the best thing to do is to Google that organization's name. If it's a journalistic organization, if it's a nonprofit, whatever it is, do some Googling, look in the Google results for websites that you know and trust that, are good sources of information, see if they've had anything to say about this group. And you can, just with like 5 minutes or less of this kind of Googling, you can get a lot of information.
While you're doing your lateral research to understand more about something you might have found online, there's a website you're bound to find in your Google results, Wikipedia. Maybe you've been told to never use Wikipedia. After all, can't anyone edit it? I know I've told many students that they aren't allowed to cite Wikipedia, but that's part of their academic research. So can Wikipedia be useful to us everyday parents trying to understand science? These were just some of the questions I was really eager to ask Dr. Eric Youngstrom.
I want to talk about HGAPS, or helping give away psychological science,
yes,
because
please.
That's exactly what you're trying to solve. And so how do people, especially parents or caregivers, find their way to psychological science that is in language I can understand and immediately, implement in my life?
Yeah.
So first, what is it? What's HGAPS?
What is HGAPS?
Yeah.
HGAPS is a charity founded in North Carolina and recognized by the IRS as a 501c3, like you guys are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It is the product of a conversation between me and a graduate student, Mian Li Ong, who is originally from Singapore and now is back in Singapore, by way of the Mayo Clinic. He and I were talking about how do you make it easier for people to use what we talk about in class and what we do in our research when they're actually trying to help people. So that was 2014. So it's been an incredible journey ever since then, because like everything that I thought I knew about Wikipedia has turned out to be wrong.
Well, that's what can you unpack that a little bit? Because you think about, what our kids are taught and even what we teach our graduate students and undergraduate students, be wary of sources like that. How do you know it's credible?
Yep.
So talk us through what did you learn about Wikipedia through this?
Circa 2014, as an academic, my reaction was Wikipedia. Ew.
Exactly.
And can anybody write that? Like anybody could write that. There's no peer review. So anybody could write it and put anything on it. It's a lot harder than that. As of right now, at the sound of the tone, here's what Wikipedia looks like. Largest encyclopedia in the world, more pages than Encyclopedia Britannica, more 15,000 pages, 15,000 articles about psychology and topics related to psychology, mm-hmm. 50,000, 100,000 related to medicine. So this is a gargantuan amount of information available for free. Nothing like it has ever existed before mm-hmm. in human history. At this exact second, there are hundreds of people editing it all around the world. We could hop on, we could try to edit a page. Most of them that we would try first are locked. so that anybody could edit it. Not true, especially for political figures, celebrities, and medicine. Anything that is tied to politics, popular media, or that affects health is very likely to be locked, and you have to level up to have a history of reasonable edits before they'll change your account so that you could actually edit the page. If any of our listeners have ever used Microsoft Word or Google Docs, if you've used an editor that lets you track changes, so you can see that here are the suggestions or here are the words that got changed, Wikipedia automatically does that. So it's got track changes forever since the beginning of when that article got started. And it tells you, here is the account that made that change. So what HGAPS is doing is trying to figure out what's the good stuff, what's the good information about psychology. What I'm coaching the students and the members to do is look for those spark notes, look for the executive summaries. And if you're a student or working at a university, you're on the inside of the paywall. So we have a free subscription to a whole bunch of stuff that a parent wouldn't be able to get access to. The hack, or the way to speed this up, because like you just walked me through, science is slow, especially science about human beings, and especially about kids. We're like, okay, so let's go straight to the Cliffs Notes, the Spark Notes. Let's make sure that we're looking at the most recent accurate ones of those. And then let's write a summary of it and put that out where a parent could find it for free. Over time, as we've gotten the hang of it, they're actually the same people that pay for Wikipedia pay for several other projects that our listeners probably know as much about as I did a couple of years ago. So Wikipedia is the rock star that everyone has heard of. Wikiversity is a sister site that is much smaller. It's the same computers, the same web face. The web pages look very, very similar, but much smaller. And that actually is where we're putting the information for clinicians and for students who are like, I think I want to become a psychologist. The newest thing that we're doing is using it for researchers, being like, here, put the detailed version of the recipe here, put more of the tips about if you're going to try to cook duck, or you really want to try to pluck a chicken,
right?
Here's the nitty gritty. So Wikiversity is like the chef school. Here's the place to find more details about how to do the prep, how to gather the right ingredients. And Wikipedia is where we're writing more for parents and the general public. So let's sort of bring it back to the pandemic. When the United States entered lockdown back in March of 2020, is that right?
Yep. In the before times, right? We don't even talk about years anymore. It's just the before and the right. Yes, March of 2020.
There was a Wikipedia page about the coronavirus. That page, right as we entered lockdown, that page was edited hundreds of times a day.
Wow.
And that page was read millions of times a day. So any change that got made to that page, there were hundreds of people fact checking it and looking at it. But we talked about how slow science is. When the good stuff finally arrives, hey, we got an updated Cliffs Notes. You could hop on the Wikipedia and say, we just got the newest edition of the Cliffs Notes, and here's what changed based on that. And you could do that within seconds. So the speed is like nothing that we have ever had before. The fact checking, so to make a change to that page is actually really, really difficult. You better be right.
Right.
And then the last part is just the reach. So like my dissertation, super duper proud when I got that done. I think 6 human beings have actually read it.
Right.
My committee and my wife and my mom, I think, finished it. And everyone else, their eyeballs glazed over. And
Yep.
I got it into a top clinical journal, which helped me get a job, helped me get tenure, helped me a lot professionally. But that article's only been cited a couple hundred times. And then the page about cognitive behavioral therapy on Wikipedia, 2 million views a year.
What a difference. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that HGAPS is trying to do is work with the professionals and the experts and hey, have you looked at your Wikipedia page? And this is happening right now. The Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy, which is a society of experts on behavioral and cognitive therapies. They looked at the article that gets 2 million readers a year, and they're like, it's good, but it could be better. And it could have more up-to-date information on it. And then if you flip the page and look at how it looks on Wiki, they're like, yeah, it used to be excellent, but now it's a B class article. And so what we're trying to do is actually get the expert editors and the expert psychologists together to update the page and have everybody agree. This once again is a top shelf article.
Accurate, updated. Right. Yeah. Oh,
because
that's amazing.
As people are looking at like, hey, what do we have as options for depression?
That's right. And if somebody recommends to me as a parent, you might want to think about cognitive behavioral therapy for your kid, and I don't even know what that means, that's where I'm going. Right. While I was talking with Eric and Melinda about science literacy for parents, I couldn't help but think about my own kids. They watch YouTube, they hear things on the playground, they eavesdrop on our conversations. How do I help them develop their own sets of tools for understanding science and thinking critically about what they hear? How we teach children and teens media literacy could be an entire episode on its own, but I really appreciated this one piece of advice that Melinda shared.
Talk to your kids, like bring them into your process for how you go about understanding science and learning about, and deciphering whether information is trustworthy. Like bring your kids into that, have talks about it, even like sharing with your kids that this is hard and it's complicated, but like, here's how I'm going to try to make sense of it. We don't want to scare our kids and for good reason, or we don't want to overwhelm them, but sometimes, I think a lot of the times, actually, it can be very, very helpful to have the conversations, to lean into these types of topics instead of leaning away from them, even if they're complicated, even if they're tough. Because if we don't have these conversations with our kids, essentially, then where are they going to get this information, right? They're just going to start trusting everything they hear from their YouTube influencers or whatnot. And we really need to give them the
playground, because let me tell you, what they're learning out there isn't right either.
Absolutely. Right. So, I mean, we want to make sure that they're getting the nuances and the complexity in a way from us, because they're not going to get it from anywhere else. And we want to be giving them the tools to ask the right questions and to, not take everything at face value, and to really pause and think like, how do I make sure that I should trust this? And so, yeah, talk about it.
So I hope it's clear from these conversations that understanding science and the way media talks about science is important. Science and media literacy help us identify what information is and is not credible as we make decisions for ourselves and for our families. In the show notes, we've included links to the resources mentioned in this episode, as well as additional resources to help you and your family continue developing science literacy. A bit of housekeeping. We are changing up our schedule a bit this season to release one episode per month. Each month, you can expect a thoughtful, succinct, and accessible discussion of some of the most recent research being published on the impact of COVID-19 on children and families. This has been an episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. We'd love to connect with you via email or on social media. Follow the links in our show notes or look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, or TikTok. And this podcast isn't all we do. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic.org. pandemic-parent.org. This season of the podcast is produced by Victoria Bruick, Carmen Vincent, and myself, Dr. Amanda Zelechoski, with strategic support from Dr. Lindsay Malloy and Pandemic Parenting's Executive Director, Jennifer Valentine. Many thanks to the Pandemic Parenting team for their work in making this show happen, including Miranda Dauphiny, Lydia Lang, Julianne Matthews, Mark Snow, and Paula Sillers. If you want to support the work of Pandemic Parenting, you can do so in a few ways. You can leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple or Spotify. You can donate to our nonprofit at www.pandemic-parent.org/support. And lastly, and most importantly, you can share this episode with parents and caregivers in your communities. Until next time, thanks for listening, and please give yourself some grace today.